Well, we talked last week about the first two phases or levels of discipline. You remember? Teaching and training, right? Because our model is teach, train, and correct. And so we looked back at our verse from 1 Thessalonians 5:14 that tells us to help the weak, and we said that is the teaching phase. And then it tells us to encourage the discouraged. We're training our kids. We're encouraging them. We're being their biggest cheerleaders. And learning to teach and train your kids is a crucial part of your discipline. But then we see that the last part of that verse tells us to admonish our kids, right? When they're idle, irresponsible, when they're lazy. And so today we're going to be talking about that third and final level of discipline, which is correction. And there's a tendency in parenting today to be all about the teaching and the training, all about the showing them how to do something and encouraging them to do it this way and redirecting, but a tendency to never move to correction. And so why is that? Well, I think there's a good reason, because correction's painful, right? I mean, how do you like when somebody corrects you? Even when you need it, it still doesn't feel good, right? It's not pleasant. But the important thing for us to realize is that we are making a mistake if we think that the loving thing is not to engage the hard thing. And so sometimes we expect our kids to understand that and to not fight against our correction. For them to just, you've read the parenting blog that says if you sit your child down and you explain to them what they did, and they will eventually understand, and they'll say, "Oh, Mommy, you are right. I'm so sorry." I'm telling you, the person who wrote that doesn't have kids. They don't, because correction is painful. You could do everything perfectly as a parent in the way you correct your child, and guess what? Your child is still not going to like it. Hebrews 12:11 tells us that. It says, "No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful." So we need to expect it. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace. Righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. And so we need to prepare ourselves for correcting our kids, that it's going to be difficult, that they're not going to like it, and that is normal. And so we need to persevere through that and continue on with correction, not stop because it doesn't feel good. And so today we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about why we should correct our kids, when to correct our kids, and how to do it. So first, why do we correct our kids? Well, first of all, God commands us to do it. He's tasked us with that as parents. Proverbs 19:18 says, "Discipline your children while there is still hope. Avoiding it can be deadly." That's pretty strong, but if you want to get a little stronger, let's look at it in the NIV. It says, "Discipline your children, for in that there is hope. Do not be a willing party to their death." None of us want to be a willing party to our children's deaths, right? But God tells us that when we don't correct our kids, that's what we're doing. And then Ephesians 6:4 tells us to bring up our children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So clearly God commands us as parents to correct our kids. But there's another reason that we need to correct our kids. And Proverbs 6:23 tells us what it is. It says, "Correction and instruction are the way to life." They're the way to life. God works in paradoxes so many times. We see in the Bible that we have to die to live, or we give to receive. We see that the weak are strong. All of those biblical concepts that seem to be the opposite of what your common sense would tell you, right? Well, this may sound a little bit weird to you, but I want you to just keep this in your mind, because the biblical paradox when it comes to discipline is that correction actually yields connection. Correction yields connection. Because correction, when it's done properly, actually moves us closer to our kids. It may not feel like it in the moment, but I want you to remember this verse, this is a paraphrase of 1 Corinthians 13, 9 and 10, and it says, now they understand in part, but when they grow up into God's perfect discipline, they will know how kind our intentions are to them. I had to even have a couple of conversations with my 17-year-old son this week and to say, my intention is not to take all the fun out of your life. My intention is not to tell you what to do and boss you around and make you do something that you don't want to do. My intention is for you to achieve what you are fighting for, to pursue your opportunities, to not have regrets later. And so our kids, a lot of times they don't understand our intentions until they grow up. But we don't need to fear correcting our kids thinking that we're maybe damaging them or damaging our relationship with them. Because if we're correcting in the right way, with the right heart attitude, we're going to talk about all of this today. If we're doing that, we're actually investing in that relationship. And so we clearly see that God has tasked us as parents with correcting our kids, and that proper correction connects us relationally to our kids. And so the next step is to know when to correct our kids. Well, we've talked about this verse a lot already, but let's go back to 1 Thessalonians 5:14. It tells us that a child needs correction when he knows your instructions and he doesn't follow them. When he's lazy, undisciplined, irresponsible. So that tells me that first and foremost, we have to look at their hearts. We have to learn how, as a parent, to separate childish behavior from willful disobedience. Because accidents from just childish behavior, they may have some consequence, but willful disobedience is going to receive a different consequence than an accident. Now, sometimes this is a little tricky to figure out, right? For example, what would you do if you walked into this? And we have a picture for you here. So let me tell you kind of what you're seeing here. This is my two girls, Caroline and Annie. Charlie was a baby. And I was so tired. Like, I don't remember this phase. I'm glad we have pictures of Charlie because I literally have maybe like 2 actual memories of him being a baby. And so I got up one morning. The girls had gotten up early, and Caroline was going to fix them breakfast. You can see their little blue picnic table in the back. They had kind of the little kids' picnic table that we had set up in the kitchen for them. And we had the brand new, like, mega-sized box of Rice Krispies. You know what I'm talking about? Like, those things are literally like 2 feet by 3 feet now. You know, and it was the brand new box. Hadn't even been opened. And so Caroline decided that she was going to make them some Rice Krispies for breakfast and not have to wake me up. Love it. Like, I'm so proud of this moment until I walk into this. But I don't know how long it's been since you've had Rice Krispies and you've poured out of that mega-sized box. It's really satisfying. You know? Like, they just kind of flow out of the box. And so she started pouring, and it overflowed the bowl. And I think at first she was like, uh-oh. And then she was like, but that was kind of fun. I mean, like, it's kind of neat the way those just pour out of there. So she just kept pouring and walking and pouring and walking until my kitchen looked like a Kellogg's factory exploded. And so I walked into this. I came around the corner, and I froze. And by the grace of God, I did not lose it. Because I typically would have. And I stopped for a minute, and I was angry for a flash. And then they're looking at me. I mean, you can see Caroline's look on her face in that picture, which is kind of like, yeah, Mom wants to take a picture, but I'm not really sure what's about to happen. Like, this might be the end for me. That's kind of the look on her face. And Annie, she's just kind of like, yeah, this is great. So we have to learn how to separate childish behavior from disobedience. Her heart was to fix them breakfast and not have to wake me up. Her heart wasn't, oh, let's make a huge mess for mom to have to clean up when she gets up. No, her heart was to be helpful. And so am I going to react in anger? I mean, at first, yeah, kind of. But am I going to correct her? No. Yes, there's going to be some instruction. Yes, we had to get a broom and they had to help clean up, and we did all of that together. There was some consequence to the behavior, but there's not a harsh correction for an accident, for childish behavior. I love this quote from Tolian Tavigian. He says, "Grace is for the brokenhearted, and the law is for the hard-hearted." Man, what a great quote. I mean, just like our 1 Thessalonians verse becomes kind of a formula for if-then, what to do in your parenting, this quote is such a great rule for us as parents. Grace is for the brokenhearted, and law is for the hard-hearted. And so as moms, we need to know when to correct and when to give our kids grace. And we do that by looking at the heart behind the action. And then once that heart attitude is corrected, there's no need for further correction. At some point, your child begins to correct themselves, hopefully. That's the goal, right? We talked last week about being the gardener of our kids' hearts that Rachel taught us, and you've got this little apprentice next to you, and hopefully they are learning how to be the gardener of their own hearts. But we have to look first at their heart. Secondly, we only move to correction after we have instructed them. Remember, teach, train, and then correct. You want to make sure that you fully instructed your kids before you correct. This is especially important in the preschool and early elementary years, where your kids are learning so many new skills. They're learning so many different things so quickly. When Caroline was in kindergarten, she came home with a new bracelet from the treasure chest. And she was showing it to me and telling me about it, but the only problem was I knew that that wasn't her day to go to the treasure chest. And so I just started asking her questions, and the more we talked, she told me that she and her best friend at the time were playing in one of their centers in their classroom next to the treasure box, and her friend said, "Hey, the teacher's not looking. Let's get a bracelet out of the treasure box." And Caroline was like, "Okay." And so they got bracelets out of the treasure box. And she's telling me this story, and I'm like, I did not raise you to be a thief. Like, that's what I'm thinking in my head. But the more she talks, I'm seeing that she's just excited and happy about her new bracelet, and she doesn't really understand. And I realized we need to go back and do some more teaching and training here. Yes, there's going to be a consequence. You're going to call your teacher, and let me tell you, that's not fun at 5 years old to call your kindergarten teacher. You're going to apologize, and you're going to take the bracelet back, but let me explain to you, that is stealing. You took something that didn't belong to you. And so sometimes it's not super clear, right? Sometimes it's figuring out the heart. It's figuring out, have I taught and trained my kids thoroughly? And sometimes, like we talked about last week, we assume our kids understand things when many times they don't. And so remember that even as our kids get older, they're constantly entering new phases. They're constantly learning new skills, and teaching and training is something that we have to continually come back to. But I want you to remember that the more time you invest in teaching and training, the better job you do with that, the less you'll have to correct your kids. So we've talked about why and when to correct our kids. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of how we correct our kids. First, it's by having the right attitude as a parent. We have to start here. Because correction requires clear objectives that are God-focused, not me-focused. And we have to remember that our goal is discipline and not punishment. And what determines that many times is the heart attitude of the parent. And so as we read through the Bible, we see how God disciplines his people in Scripture. We see that he demonstrates his love abundantly, loud and clear. He tells us how much he loves us. He's clear and direct in his commands. He says, be kind. He says, love, honor. He gives us clear commands. He warns us and lays out ensuing consequences for disobedience. He doesn't keep his expectations hidden. He issues specific rebukes and corrections. And he promises reward and hope when we obey. God's purposeful, he's clear, he's direct, he's consistent, he's honest, he's authoritative, and he's loving. And we should follow that example. So how does this translate to our daily lives as moms? What does this look like practically? Here's some general rules. Number one, just be respectful of your kid when you're disciplining them, when you're correcting them. Don't discipline them in front of other people, in front of other children. Don't embarrass them. Don't make correction a personal attack by saying you are or you always. Make it about the behavior. Don't discipline them in anger. Sometimes we need to say, I need a minute, and then we're going to have to talk about this. Do be empathetic and tell your child, I'm so sorry that you chose to disobey in this situation. Well, this week and next week, we're going to look at 6 specific, very practical methods of correction. And I'm going to start with 4 of those today, and then we'll finish the others next week. But the first one is extinction. And that's just a fancy word for ignoring a behavior. Okay, now, everybody listen to me. This cannot be your primary go-to method of parenting. Okay? You can't just say, well, Carrie said I could use extinction, so I'm just going to ignore everything that they're doing. This has to be for minor behaviors. But realize you don't have to engage every single small thing that your child is doing wrong. This is great for if you're at home and your child is whining about something and they're laying in the floor rolling around about this is not the snack they wanted a different snack, and can you please cut their sandwich differently, and whatever they're whining about, guess what you can do? You can just walk away and you can just leave them there. And a lot of times, like, they're still whining because they think you're standing in there, and it's really funny if you're around the corner in the next room and you're listening, because all of a sudden they'll stop. And they're like, wait, I just lost my audience. But that's the perfect time for you to use extinction. Just ignore it. And they'll get the picture that, hey, this isn't going to work, and they'll move on and they'll try something different. And if they don't get the message, you can tell them, I will not be listening to you as long as you're whining and complaining. When you're ready to talk to me, come find me. And then you walk away. And that's all there is to it. The second one is time out, or a different version called time in. Now, most of you have probably heard about and or used and or been in time out yourself. Time out can be useful when your child needs to stop. When we just need a break from something and everyone needs to kind of settle down. It can be a great thing to use when your child is just in a highly emotional state and everyone just kind of feels out of control. The key to timeout is it always needs a follow-up. Whether that's more teaching and training, whether that's a redo like we talked about last week, or making restoration for wrong behavior. But sometimes we have to start with a timeout to be in a mindset where we can go back and address what happened in the situation. Now, if you have a child who's highly sensitive, or maybe has some separation anxiety, or maybe you have a child who has been in foster care or that you've adopted, maybe has a history of abuse or abandonment, or maybe you don't know that child's history. You could use a slightly different version called time in. This is the same thing where we're going to take a break for a minute, but instead of separating that child from your presence and sending them to their room or to another room, you're just going to keep them with you. And you're going to say, you know what? We're going to take a break for a minute. I need you to sit down next to me. We're going to calm down, and you tell me when you're ready to talk. It's just keeping them with you, not separating them. And so some kids need space to be alone, and they need a timeout. And some kids need to maintain that closeness to you in your physical presence. And you can still do that with time in. The third method I want us to look at today is spanking. We're going to spend a little more time here because I know that this is a controversial topic, right? This is a topic where people have a lot of different opinions. And I'm not here to give you, you should or you shouldn't do this. In fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics actually has an official stance against spanking. You may know that. A lot of moms read that, stating that it's not effective and can actually be harmful to the development of your child. And so a lot of parents are afraid to use spanking, and I get that. And I want to talk about that for a minute, because when you look at the perspective of the AAP and you look at the literature that they have used around spanking, I can see how they came to their conclusion. And when I read those same things, I would come to the same conclusion. Because let's be honest, most spanking is done out of anger and frustration, right? And so you can feel the undercurrent of those attitudes when you look at the literature that they're looking at. And so I agree with them. Spanking done in anger is not discipline, it's child abuse. And yes, that is harmful to the development of your child. When you discipline in anger, the focus is moved from your child's behavior onto you. And the child learns nothing except that mom's not capable of handling herself. And it's no longer about what I did, it's about her, and she's out of control. And what that breeds in your child is insecurity, fear, and as they get a little bit older, resentment. So let's consider that maybe the problem is not spanking itself, but rather the way it's delivered. And let's not allow fear to be our decision maker. Let's look at these methods and consider their usefulness and realize that any form of correction used inappropriately can be harmful in your child, harmful to your child. Time out seems pretty harmless, right? Well, not if you leave their kid in their room for 3 days. Anything can be taken to an unhealthy place. So let's look at spanking objectively. In your small group, you're going to look at some verses in your homework about the rod, what the Bible refers to as the rod. And people interpret that word differently, some more specific, some more general, and that's fine. But what I want you to hear today is the Bible presents spanking done correctly as an acceptable method of discipline, but not a required method. The Bible never says, to be a good parent, you must spank your child. No, it doesn't. You must discipline your child, but it never says you must spank your child. So spanking is one tool in your toolbox, but used appropriately, it can be very effective. Now, you would never spank your child if your child has a history of abuse, if you have a history of abuse, if you or your child or even your husband has a history of anger problems, or if you have a fostered or adopted child and you don't know what their background holds. Just take it out of the toolbox. It's not worth it. But spanking can be and should be used in this situation for persistent, defiant disobedience. It should not be the first method that you choose, and it must be done in the context of relationship. You're going to use spanking when you are sure your child knows what to do and consciously chooses not to do it. Or more often, when you've told them not to do something and they do it anyway. Some general guidelines for spanking. Remember that you're spanking for the offense and not to break your child's spirit. Some people say, well, I should spank my child until they're crying and they're remorseful. Yeah, that's a slippery slope. I heard someone say a good rule of thumb and discipline is to think about it like a police officer He pulls you over, writes the ticket, and then you go on, right? And so that's what we want to do in our discipline as well. We want to give the offense, and then, or give the consequence for the offense, and then we're going to move on. And so spanking is not done to achieve a broken spirit. Spanking does not work for every kid. I can tell you from experience, spanking did not work for my middle child. It just did not. It must be done appropriately. We're going to walk through that in just a second. And typically, spanking is used for younger children, somewhere around that 18-month age when you're sure they understand. And then only up to about maybe ages 8 or 9. It's mostly going to be used in that toddler and preschool age range when sitting them down and trying to have a reasonable, logical conversation with them. They're not capable of that yet. That's when spanking is a good tool. Also, you need to warn your child that the next time they touch that object, or the next time they run away from you, or the next time they don't do something, you need to warn them that the next time that happens, there will be a spanking. Remember, we don't want to surprise our kids with correction. We want to make sure they understand. And then finally, spanking must be carried out in a calm and in control manner. You cannot spank in anger. That's crossing the line into child abuse. And if you're going to be using spanking to discipline your child, your own heart must be in line with God's character. It's got to be just. It's got to be purposeful. It has to be self-controlled. And then most importantly, you've got to have a heart for redemption and restoration, not for punishment. So I just want to walk you through what spanking looks like when it's done correctly. First, you're going to get alone in private with that child. You're not going to spank them in front of all the kids in the neighborhood or other parents, or you're going to get alone with that child where it's just the two of you. And you're going to say, what is our rule? Or you might say, what did mommy tell you to do? And then they're going to answer if they can. Now, sometimes they're old enough to understand, but they don't have the language skills to verbalize it yet, right? So you may say that for them. If they're old enough to know, man, Caroline, I don't have time to tell you the story, but I am going to anyway because it's one of my best. But when we were trying to teach Caroline to stay in the bed, she was about 18 months old when we moved her to a twin bed. And we would tuck her in the bed, and we would turn around, and by the time we were to the door, she's out right behind us. And I mean, we went through this over and over and over for I don't know how many nights. And so I'm tucking her in one night, and that same thing happens, and I finally picked her up, and I sat her down next to me, and I said, what did mommy tell you to do? And she looked at me, and she said, stay bed. And I was like, dang it. And she said, and I said, and what did you do? She said, get out bed. And I was like, ugh. Because I was going back and forth with myself. Does she understand? Does she know what she's supposed to do? I'm not totally sure. Well, now I'm sure because she just told me. So you're going to walk through it with your child. You're going to say, what did I tell you to do? And if they can't say it back to you yet, you're going to say, I told you to stay in the bed. And you're going to say, what did you do? And they're going to say, get out bed. And you're going to say, okay, you did not do what mommy told you to do. You're not going to apologize to them for spanking them or disciplining them. You can empathize with them. You can say, I'm sorry you chose to get out of the bed after I told you not to. And then you're going to spank them. And then guess what? It's over. That's the benefit of spanking, is it's over quickly. And then you're going to hug them and you're going to love them and you're going to say, I'm trying to help you make the right choices. I need you to obey. I'd love to talk to you further about this if you have questions. Again, spanking is a tool in your toolbox. I'm not saying you have to use it, but I'm saying if you want to, you can if you do it the right way. It can be very effective. It's never used as a reaction or when you're angry. The final method of correction I want to mention is using rewards. Now, we talked about this last week a little more in depth because rewards are mostly used in that training phase when we're trying to establish good behaviors and good habits with our kids. But they can also be used in the correction phase when we're trying to break certain habits and behaviors. I just want to mention a couple of things that I want you to remember. I want you to remember that when you're using rewards as a form of correction, you don't want to be bribing your child. It's so easy when you're out in public and your child is throwing the fit of all fits to say, I'll do whatever you want, just stop now. We've all done it. We've all been there. If you haven't, you will. It does happen, but I want you to remember not to use rewards as a bribe. Remember, a bribe is something that you come up with in the moment to try to control the behavior. But a reward is something that's set up ahead of time. It's something that we're consistent with, and it's something that we don't give unless that child earns it. So if you missed last week, go back and listen to that. Make sure that you understand the line between a reward and a bribe, and you understand those differences. So those are the first 4 methods you can use to correct your kids, okay? Extinction, time out or time in, spanking, and rewards. And next week, we're going to talk about 2 more methods of correction. But I want you to remember that it is essential that we correct our kids. It's essential. Remember, it brings life. It brings a harvest of righteousness and peace. And so as we close today, I just want you to do this quickly for me. I want you to take your pen and just draw a line across the top of your paper. And on one end, on the left end, I want you to write under correcting. And on the right side, I want you to write over correcting. And then right in the middle, I want you to just put a mark, and under it, I want you to write perfectly balanced. And then as we close today, I just want you to think for a second. Where do I fall on this line? Do I need to step up and begin correcting my kids a little bit more? Am I over-correcting them and I need to be a little more balanced? And I'm just going to pray for us as we close, that God would give us wisdom to be as close to that middle as we can. God, thank you. God, I thank you that correction done the right way is beautiful. And you've made it that way. You designed it that way. Because it restores us, God. It restores us to a relationship with each other. It restores us to a relationship with you. And so would you make correction beautiful in our families? Would you make it redemptive? Would it not be about control and about behavior, but would it be about hearts that reflect you, that are more like you, that are bound together in relationship? And as we correct our kids, God, would you give us wisdom to do it in a way that brings connection? God, we love you, praise you. Would you walk before us this week? Even now, begin preparing us, God, for the situations that we're going to address. Give us wisdom, give us courage, and give us perseverance as moms. Most of all, increase our love for you and our love for our kids. We love you in Jesus' name. Amen.